many other developers simply don't have. Then in sections 9 and 10, we will keep working on our JavaScript fundamentals, but now with a focus on more modern ES6 topics, such as maps and destructuring, and also strings, functions, closures, and more. Then, throughout sections 11 and 12, we will build our next beautiful project, which will teach you all you need to know about array methods, numbers, dates, and timers. And after that, we jump right into our next project, which is gonna be this beautiful website, full packed with visual effects and components such as lazy image loading, a tabbed component, a slider, and so much more. In section 14, we finally reach the pretty advanced, but also very important topic of object-oriented programming with constructor functions and ES6 classes, which will then, in the next section, allow us to build this stunning real-world project. And besides object-oriented programming, this project will also teach you how to incorporate a map and how to actually plan and structure a project, which is also super important. After that, you're gonna learn all about asynchronous JavaScript, which is used for things like loading data from external web servers with Ajax. Then in sections 17 and 18, we will learn how modern JavaScript applications are actually built using cutting-edge technologies like NPM, Babel, Parcel, and ES6 modules. We then take these modern tools and everything that we have learned up until this point to build this biggest and coolest project in the course. And we then even finish this project by deploying it to the internet using Netlify and Git in section 19. So as you see, I included everything you need to know about JavaScript in this course, along with a ton of real-world projects and challenges. Now, your next step is to watch the next lecture, which is super important to set you up for success in this course, with instructions for many things like how to ask questions. Now, if you already know the fundamentals of JavaScript, then after the next lecture, please move ahead to the section called How to Navigate this course, where you will then find your perfect learning path to navigate this huge course. But if you're new to JavaScript, then of course just move on to the next section. Alright, so I hope that you're gonna have a ton of fun with this course, that you become a really advanced JavaScript developer, and that you will take your web development career to the next level. And with that being said, let's finally get started. Now, before you start, here are 10 quick considerations on how to take this course. And I promise they are super short and super important. So please don't skip this video. And first of all, there are many different types of students in this course. Some have never programmed in their life. Others have experience with other languages, but not with JavaScript. And even others have some experience with JavaScript, but want to become even more advanced. And this course is for all of you. Everyone is welcome. So please don't write a bad review right away if the course is too easy or too hard or progressing too slow or too fast for you. I built this course with everyone in mind. Now, to make the course perfect for you, you can always rewatch lectures, jump to other more advanced sections, watch the course with slower or faster playback speed, or ask questions in the Q&A section. Of course, you can give a 1-star review if the course is absolutely terrible, but please at least wait a couple of sections to get a good idea of the course. Now, about actually taking the course, you need to code along with me. And this is crucial. You will learn exactly 0 JavaScript skills by just sitting and watching me code. So you have to code yourself, even if you're just typing the same code as I am typing in the video. It doesn't matter as long as you're coding. Next, try all the coding challenges. Do the best that you can, but if you get stuck for too long, then simply watch the solution. And I can't stress this enough. You have to try the coding challenges, because otherwise you will miss half of the learning opportunity in this course. And please don't beat yourself up if you can't figure out the solution. This is completely normal, trust me. And figuring out the solution is actually not even the main point of these challenges. So if that happens, just rewatch the lectures that were covered, try to understand them better, and move on. If you want the course material to stick, then take notes. Notes on code syntax, notes on theory concepts, and really notes on everything. You can't take too many notes. And everyone has their own style, so just find yours. Now, if this is your first time ever programming, then please don't get overwhelmed. It's 100% normal that you will not understand everything at the beginning. Just keep going through the first few sections, even if you don't understand everything at first. You soon will, believe me. But please just don't think, I guess coding is not for me. That thought is simply not allowed here, okay? So keep in mind that everyone has different learning speeds. I've seen tens of thousands of students progressing through my courses. So believe me, this is completely normal. In the first couple of sections of the course, don't bother understanding exactly why things work the way they do in JavaScript. Also, in the beginning, don't stress about efficient code or fast code or clean code. That's all super important, don't get me wrong, but in the first few sections while still learning, we just want to make things work. We will understand the why later in the course, and of course, make the code clean as well. The sections in the course build on one another. So before moving on from a section, make sure that you understand exactly what was covered. So take a break, review the code that we wrote, review your notes, and review the projects that we built. And maybe even write some code yourself in order to practice. Only then you're ready to move on. If you ever have an error in your code or a question, always start by trying to solve it yourself, because this is absolutely essential for your progress. Now, if you cannot solve the problem, then check the Q&A section, because someone probably already had the same problem before. And if that doesn't help either, then just ask a new question. And to do that, use a short description, post your code on codepen.io, and share the link in the Q&A. Because without the code, we will not be able to help you. I built and recorded this course on a Mac, but everything works the exact same way on Windows or Linux. So if something doesn't work on your computer, it's not because you're using a different operating system. Okay? And now, finally, and most importantly, have fun. Coding is a lot of fun, and it's so rewarding to see something that you have built yourself. So if you're feeling frustrated for some reason, stop whatever you're doing and come back later. Always, always have fun while coding. Okay? And with that being said, let's now get started. Now, before we can write any code, we need to install and configure a code editor. So, a code editor is the main tool for any developer, and we use it, as the name says, to write our actual code. And so let's now go download a code editor. And the one that I advise everyone to use is Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short. So this is, in my opinion, the best code editor by far that exists. And that's not just my own opinion. So VS Code is right now by far the most popular and most widely used code editor. And that is for a reason. It simply is the best and easiest to use, and of course, it is completely free. Now, there are alternatives if you don't like VS Code for some reason. So you can use Atom, or you can use something like Brackets as well, which is the code editor that I used to teach a previous version of this course. But again, I'm going to use VS Code in this course, and so I really advise you to follow this course using the exact same code editor to make everything easier for you to follow. So, again, this code editor is completely free, and it works on every platform. So just download whatever installer that you need for your own platform, then install, of course, that code editor on your computer, and once you're done, come back to this video so that we can together set it up a little bit, just so that we can get started in the next section. Okay, so I hope that you managed to install VS Code on your system. And as you open it up, it should look something like this. Now, the colors should probably all be different, but we will fix that in a second. And maybe this welcome screen also looks different, and maybe these icons here, because you might have installed the editor sometime after I recorded this video. But anyway, the main things should still work the same. And so let's actually start by installing a theme. So a theme is basically all the colors that you see here on the screen, and also the colors in the actual code that you're going to write. Okay? Now you don't need to install a theme, so you can simply change one of the themes that is already included in VS Code. So just click down here on this icon and then call a theme, and then here you can try one of these out. And so if you like one of them, you can simply keep that one. And so if you like one of them, you can simply keep that one, but one of these out. Icon and then call a theme, and then here you can try. So just click down here on this icon and then call a theme, and then here you can try one of these out. And so if you like one of them, you can simply keep that one. But as you see, the theme that I have is this Monokai Pro. And this one was not included by default by VS Code. And so if you want to install the same theme as I have, then simply come here to this Extensions tab and then search for Monokai Pro. Okay, then it's this first one here, and then you can simply, probably somewhere here, click on download. Now this theme is actually a paid theme that you can buy for about $10 or so. However, you can actually also use the theme for free forever. It will then just ask you every couple of days for you to buy it. But for me, that has never been a big problem. Now I just wanted to quickly mention that I'm not in any way affiliated with this theme and that this is not an advertisement. So this is simply the theme that I love and that I use every single day. But of course, you can use a different theme or a theme that you have already been using yourself. But if you like the theme, then you can support the creator, or you can use the theme for free, or you can of course also use another theme. And one other theme that is very similar, and which actually already comes with VS Code, is Monokai Classic. So it's this one. So the colors here look a little bit different, but the Monokai Pro theme that I use is actually based on this one. And so therefore colors are quite similar, and so therefore this one is also a good pick in case you want to use a very similar theme to mine, but don't want to use Monokai Pro. But I'm going to set it back to Monokai Pro now, and so that's it about the theme. And so let's now move on and also talk about VS Code settings. And so here I'm going to show you a couple of settings that I'm using in the course videos, and that you should probably use as well, to make it easier for you to follow the videos and also to code on your own later on. So the first setting is this autosave setting that you should set to on focus change. Okay? And so what this will do is that whenever you leave the code editor or you go to some other file, then it will automatically save that file without you having to do anything. So that's very helpful. Now, if this isn't showing up here for you, up here you can simply search for everything. So you can simply search autosave like this, and then again change it to on focus change. Then you could also change the font size, but that's not really important for you. Then another one is this multi-cursor modifier, and this one sounds a bit weird, but you can simply set it to Control-Command, or you can leave it at Alt. So just when you need it, just know which of the two you selected. But for now, again, this is not important. I will only start using it a bit later. Then I also have the word wrap turned on, but again, that's not that important. Okay, so I think those are actually the most important ones. There's just another one that you need to change, and that is called format on save. Alright, so just turn this one here on, which says that a formatter must be available, and by now it is not, but in one of the next sections we will actually install a formatter to automatically format our code, and by then this setting here must be turned on. Okay, and that's actually it for this lecture already. Now just notice that I'm working on a Mac here, but everything will work exactly the same on Windows and on Linux. So this VS Code editor, as I mentioned earlier, works just the same on all the platforms. Now just one final and small adjustment that we can make, which I just remembered, is that besides changing the main color theme, we can also change the theme of the file icons. And so again, if you want your VS Code to look exactly the same as mine, then you can select these SETI icons here. So by default, I think it should be this minimal, but I prefer these ones here. And so by selecting this one here, then your code editor will probably look exactly the same as mine. Alright, and with that, we are actually ready to move on. Just make sure that you also have the latest version of Google Chrome installed on your computer, because that is going to be the browser in which we will be testing our code. Alright, but with that, we are now really done with this video, and so I see you in the next one. Welcome to the first section of the course. In this section, you will start learning the very basics of the JavaScript language. So things like variables, data types, operators, if-else statements, and more. So in this part, we will not yet start building beautiful user interfaces. We will do that later, of course, but first we need to focus on the language fundamentals. And so these lectures are designed for you to learn these fundamentals and to give you an overview of the language before we actually dive deeper in later sections. Okay, so let's go start this journey right now. So let's now write our very first line of JavaScript code. And for now, we will do that in the browser developer tools. So just to get started as quick as possible. We will then switch to the code editor that we just installed before in the next video. So make sure to open up Google Chrome, and then there are 3 ways in which we can open up the Chrome developer tools. First, we can hit Command-Option-J on the keyboard, and that's on Mac. So on Windows, that's going to be Control-Alt-J. And so this will then open up this console that we see here. So all of these tabs here are basically the developer tools, but we are just interested in the console. Okay? Now another way of opening the developer tools is by right-clicking and then inspect, which will bring us here to the Elements tab, and then from there we can go to the console. And the third way, and I'm showing you all of them because I know that different people like to do it in different ways. So the third way is to come here to the Chrome menu, and then in there we go to View, Developer, and then JavaScript Console. Okay, and so we're back to the JavaScript console. And I'm increasing the font here a little bit by hitting Command plus and give it some more space. Now this JavaScript developer console allows us to write and test JavaScript code. So it's very useful during development, for example, to fix errors. Now we don't write real applications, of course, using this console, but now just to get started, let's use the console because it's a good and easy way to just write some JavaScript here. So let's write alert, which is a so-called JavaScript function, then open up parentheses and without a space between alert and the parentheses, and then we write a so-called string, so which is basically text, and let's write hello world. So that's the standard way of learning programming in any programming language. Then we write the closing parentheses, and then let's hit return or enter. And you see that JavaScript gave us this pop-up window here which says hello world, just as we typed here in our string in our code. Great! So that's your very first line of JavaScript code right there. So any code that we write here and then hit return will immediately get evaluated. Okay, but of course we can do a lot more. So let's write some more JavaScript code, which of course you do not need to understand yet. I just want you to show some stuff that we can do. We will go into how everything works as we progress through this section. Okay? So just to experiment a little bit, let's write a so-called variable. So let's say let JS equals amazing. And so once more, we are basically writing a string here, so text, and then we will do if and open parentheses JS is equal to amazing. Then we want an alert window, like we saw before, saying JavaScript is fun. And if I hit now return, we get this window which says JavaScript is fun. Okay? So again, I will explain all these concepts and how all of this works here as we go through this section. But for now, I hope that you can see the logic that we basically defined JS as being amazing, and then here in the next line we said that if JS is equal to amazing, then JavaScript should show us this alert window with this text. Okay, and now we can also change JS to boring, hit return again, and now let's copy this text here again. So we want to run it again, so I'm just copying it and pasting it here. Okay, so let's try that again, and this time nothing happened. And so that's because JS is now no longer amazing, it is boring. And so in this case, if JavaScript is amazing is not actually true, right? Because it's boring now. And so in this case, the alert window is not shown. Now there's also another way of going to the previous command, which is by hitting the up arrow on the keyboard. So just like this, and so we can see all the previous commands that we used before. Great. Now another thing that we can do is to do simple math operations. Let's say just 40 plus 8 plus 23 minus 10, let's say. Hit return, and then here we get the result. So basically we can use this as a calculator, and I hope that you can see how useful this is going to become later down the road. Okay, and that's it for now. So I hope that this gave you a nice first taste of the language and of everything that is ahead. So if you want, you can experiment a little bit more with this, or you can move on right to the next lecture where we will learn what JavaScript actually is. So see you there. So you've already written a line or two of JavaScript. But what exactly is JavaScript? And what can we do with it? Well, that's exactly what we're going to find out in this video. And so in this lecture, we will set the stage for the rest of the course. And so it's really important that you follow this one until the end. So we can define JavaScript in many different ways. But my definition is that it's a high-level, object-oriented, multi-paradigm programming language. And with that being said, can we move on to the next lecture now? Well, probably not. Because what does any of that actually mean? So let's deconstruct this just a little bit to at least make some sense out of this. And starting with programming language itself, a programming language is basically just a tool that allows us to write code that will instruct a computer to do something. And of course, that's our main goal of using JavaScript, right? Then I go on and say that JavaScript is a high-level language, which means that we don't have to think about a lot of complex stuff, such as managing the computer's memory while it runs our program. So in JavaScript, there are a lot of so-called abstractions over all these small details that we don't want to worry about. And this makes the language a lot easier to write and to learn. Next, I say that JavaScript is object-oriented, and all that means is that the language is mostly based on the concept of objects for storing most kinds of data. And of course, we will learn all about object-oriented programming throughout this course. Finally, JavaScript is also a multi-paradigm language, meaning that it's so flexible and versatile that we can use all kinds of different programming styles, such as imperative and declarative programming. And these different styles are just different ways of structuring our code, basically. Again, you will learn all about this throughout the course. This is just the first, very high-level overview, but I hope it's been making sense so far. Anyway, now that we know what JavaScript actually is, at least kind of, what is the role that it plays in web development? Or in other words, what do we actually use it for? And to answer that question, let's actually look at the three core technologies of the web: HTML, CSS, and of course, JavaScript. So these three technologies all work together to create beautiful, interactive, and dynamic websites or web applications. Now, the HTML is responsible for the content of the page. So the text, the images, the buttons, and all the content that you see on a web page is always written in HTML. Then the CSS is responsible for the presentation of that content. So basically for styling and for laying out the elements on a web page. And then finally, JavaScript is the real programming language of the internet, and it allows developers to add dynamic and interactive effects to any web page. We also use it to manipulate the content or the CSS, load data from remote servers, and really build entire applications in the browser, which we then call web applications. Now we can also use the analogy of nouns, adjectives, and verbs to make the separation of roles a bit easier to understand. So in this analogy, HTML represents the nouns, for example, saying that the P element is a paragraph. And so paragraph is the noun here. The CSS then is the adjective, because it describes the noun. Like this piece of CSS saying, the paragraph text is red. And so here, red is the adjective describing the noun. And finally, JavaScript is of course the verb, like saying hide the paragraph. And so here we are doing something, and so we have a verb. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, since we've been talking a lot about dynamic effects and web applications here, let's now actually take a look at a real example to make it even more clear what JavaScript is capable of. And so this is the Twitter web application on twitter.com, and there is a lot happening as we open a profile page like this one. And so I thought that this was a very cool example. So right off the bat, you see that there are these two rotating spinners on the page, meaning that JavaScript is probably loading some data from the Twitter service in the background. Then, as the data arrives, JavaScript hides these spinners and instead shows the loaded content. So this is a very cool example of manipulating styles and content, right? But there's also some simpler dynamic effect on this page, like JavaScript showing the tweet box whenever we hit the tweet button and then hides it as we click outside of that box. And finally, JavaScript also displays this really nice user information as we hover our mouse over any user on Twitter. And it probably also loads this data on the fly. So a lot of cool stuff going on here, and it's all powered by JavaScript. How cool is that? And in fact, by the end of the course, you'll actually know how to use all of these techniques that we just saw here. And so I hope that this makes you even more excited about all the content ahead. Alright, now that we saw what JavaScript is really capable of, let's quickly recap, and also look at other cool stuff that we can build with the power of JavaScript. So as you already know, JavaScript allows us to add dynamic effects to pages, and, in fact, to build entire web applications in the browser. And these applications feel almost like the apps that we use on our computers and phones every single day. So we can say that JavaScript is what made modern web development, and really the whole modern web itself, possible in the first place. Now, if you're already somewhat familiar with the web development industry, you probably heard of modern JavaScript libraries and frameworks such as React, Angular, or Vue, right? And if you didn't, that's absolutely no problem. All you need to know is that these are basically tools that make writing modern, large-scale web applications a lot easier and faster. Now, what matters here is that all these frameworks and libraries are still 100% based on JavaScript. And what this means is that you should become really, really good at JavaScript before learning and using any of these frameworks, and not just jump into your first framework after you know how to write like 10 lines of JavaScript, okay? Also, your library of choice might not always be as popular as it is today. And the best way to be prepared is, you guessed it, becoming really good at JavaScript, because then you can easily learn whatever is popular next. So no matter what anyone tells you, learning JavaScript properly is the single best investment that you can make in your web development career right now. Now, the JavaScript language and the web browser are actually two separate things. And what that means is that JavaScript can also run outside of web browsers. For example, it's possible to use JavaScript on a web server using a very popular technology called Node.js, which doesn't need any browser at all. And this allows us to create so-called back-end applications, which are simply applications that run on a web server and interact with databases and stuff like that. On the other hand, when we use JavaScript in the browser, we create so-called front-end applications. So in this course, we will learn the ins and outs of the JavaScript language itself, and of course also how to use it in the browser in order to create all these amazing effects that we've been talking about. So basically, we're going to be building front-end web applications. And in the future, I might also add a section about Node.js at the end of this course, so that you can get a sense of how we can use JavaScript outside of the browser environment as well. Alright, and now just to finish, I want to mention that we can actually also use JavaScript to build kind of native mobile applications, as well as native desktop applications for any phone and computer operating system out there. That's because of modern tools like React Native, the Ionic framework, and tools like Electron. These have completely changed the whole development industry over the last couple of years, making things possible that were never possible before. So as you can see, there's almost nothing that you can't build after becoming really good at JavaScript, which, if you think about it, is really kind of mind-blowing. It's just amazing because the possibilities are so endless. Okay, and now to finish this lecture, I want to briefly talk about JavaScript releases, or versions, as you might call them. We will come back to this topic by the end of the section because it's super important, but it's also a good idea to get a first overview of JavaScript releases at this point. Anyway, to make a long story short, there has been a huge update to the language in 2015, which is officially called ES 2015. But most people just call it ES6, simply because it was the release after ES5. And by the way, ES stands for ECMAScript. Now, after ES 2015, there is now a yearly new release with a couple new JavaScript features. And all of these new releases, or versions, starting from ES 2015, is what we call modern JavaScript. But why am I telling you all this? Well, it's simply because in this course, I'm going to teach you modern JavaScript right from the beginning. And I wanted to make that very clear right from the start. However, I'm also convinced that you need to understand what came before ES 2015, so ES5. And so I will also show you what's important of ES5. The reason for that is in a complete video about JavaScript releases at the end of this section. Because now I no longer want to bore you with theory. So instead, let's now finally get started. Alright, now that we know what JavaScript actually is, let's now learn how to write code in a special JavaScript file and then how to run the code in the browser. Now, to get started with this section and with this course, you need to start by downloading the starter code from this GitHub repository that I created for this course. So this repository is at this URL here, which, in case you missed it, is at the very beginning of the course. So in the first text lecture of the first section. And in order to now actually download all of the starter code, all you need to do is to click on this green button here and then download zip. Okay? Now, by the time you're watching this video, GitHub, which is this website where developers basically host code, so later this website might look a little bit different, but just watch probably for a green button, which then says download zip. Alright? Now, if you're on a smaller screen, or maybe on mobile, then this green button will actually not be visible here. So in that case, just scroll down a little bit here to the FAQ section, and then here you have this link. So you can also download all the code by simply clicking this link here. And by the way, since we're already here in the FAQs, please make sure to also read all of them before you actually move on in the course. So you will probably have one of these questions at some point, and so it's easier to then simply find the answer right here. Okay, but that's it here for GitHub. Now let's go ahead and extract all of this data that we just downloaded. And so here we go. So this is the starter code, and here you have basically one folder for each section or each project that we're building in the course. Then inside of each of these folders, you will always have one final folder and one starter folder. So you see that happens in all of these folders here. Now, the final folder is basically the final version of the code as it looks by the end of the section or by the end of the project. And so in case something goes wrong in your code while you're following the section, please then compare your code with the final code that is included for each of these sections. And that will then allow you to find and fix any mistake that you might have made in your code so that you can keep going in the section. But anyway, what we're most interested in the beginning is the starter code. So each of these folders has the starter code, and that's basically the starting point of each of these sections or projects. So let's now actually drag this folder here onto the desktop, and then I'm going to open it up here separately. And in my case here, since I'm actually the one writing the code first, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have these two folders here. So I'll actually go ahead and take the index out, but you should not do that. So you should use this starter folder here as your project folder in VS Code. Okay, but again, I will now delete these two because I don't need them here to build this course, basically. But anyway, let's now open up a new VS Code window. So new window, and then here we click on open folder. And then we are already in the desktop. Let's just make the window a bit bigger here. And then I will select my project folder here. So in my case, that's going to be this folder. But again, you should now use that starter folder that's in here as your project folder. So I think that's the best way for you to approach this. So with that project folder selected, hit open. And then here we see the index.html file that we already had in our starter code. And this basically. But anyway, let's now open up a new VS Code window. So new window, and then here we click on open folder. And then we are already in the desktop. Let's just make the window a bit bigger here. And then I will select my project folder here. So in my case, that's going to be this folder. But again, you should now use that starter folder that's in here as your project folder. So I think that's the best way for you to approach this. So with that project folder selected, hit open. And then here we see the index.html file that we already had in our starter code. And this is an HTML file because usually JavaScript is attached to web pages. at least when we're building front-end applications, as we learned in the last video. So to start, we always need an HTML document like this, because our JavaScript needs to be attached to an HTML document. Now in HTML, there is a script tag where we can write JavaScript. So let's do that here in the head, right beneath this style. And if you're completely new to HTML and have no idea how it works, there is a very short crash course on HTML and CSS in section 5 of this course, I believe. So if you want, you can take that just to learn about the very basics of HTML and CSS in like 30 minutes or so. Anyway, let's now create this script tag here, in which we will write our JavaScript now. Because in the first video, we wrote JavaScript in the console, remember? But that's not how real development works. So instead, of course, we write the code in files. So let's just write, for now, the same code that we wrote in the first video. So let's JS equal amazing. And then in JavaScript, we usually add a semicolon to the end of each line. And this will then let JavaScript know that we are done with this line. And it's actually not really mandatory, and you will see some people omit the semicolons, but I still consider it a good coding practice, and I believe it makes the code a bit cleaner. So, just like before, we are then saying if JavaScript is amazing, then alert that JavaScript is fun. And once again, don't worry yet about how this code here works, okay? Just type it for now, and just have a general idea of what it does. Now, to actually execute this code, so in this example, to show this alert window, all we have to do is to open up index.html in the browser, because, again, this is where our JavaScript is now attached to, right? So, let's do that. And so I'm going back to my desktop, and then open this file with Google Chrome. And indeed, right away, we get this alert saying JavaScript is fun. And so that is coming from our index.html. We can click OK, and then it finishes. And we see or starter file, which is actually this text. So if you see in VS Code, JavaScript Fundamentals Part 1 in this H1 tag is exactly what we see here. And so we opened up the right page, and also our JavaScript is working. So if we reload this page now, we should see that alert window again. And indeed, here it is. Okay, let's push this to the side here. Here's the code from our previous lecture, VS Code, and push it to the other side. Okay. We can then get rid of this sidebar here that we don't need by hitting Command or Control B, or by clicking this file icon. And with this, we have enough space to see the editor and the browser here on the other side. So let me show you something very important now, which is how to see results from our code back in the browser. So let's take this math operations that we did in the previous lecture. So that was 40 plus 8 plus 23 minus 10. Let's give it a save. And you see that JavaScript actually automatically formatted this code. And I will show you later how you can set that up for yourself. Anyway, if we now reload this page here, where do you think this result will appear? So clearly it's not in this alert, and it's also nowhere on this page, because we didn't tell JavaScript to put it on the page. So let's open up the inspector here, and I will do inspect, and then the console, and then again increase the text, command plus, plus, and plus again. And you see that the result is also not in the console. So why is that? Why is this result not in the console like it was before? Well, it's because the console is just an environment that was built to execute small pieces of code and then show results immediately. So just like we did in the previous lecture. But it doesn't show results of our operations in code by default. Now, if we still want to display results, for example, from a calculation like this here in the console, we need to tell JavaScript to explicitly output that result to the console. And we can do that using a special function called console.log. Okay? And then if we take this code here and copy and paste it, and then save it, and then reload, then we need to click OK so that JavaScript can move on to the next line. And then we actually get the result printed to the console here. And it actually says that it's coming from index.html at line 31. And so that's exactly the line where we did do this computation. Okay, but let's recap here, because I know that this is confusing for many beginners. So in the last lecture, we were already in the console, and so then there was no need for using console.log. We also needed no script tag when we were in the console, right? But now we are actually in a script, and no longer in the console. And so now we need to explicitly say console.log whenever we want to access the developer console, like we did here. Okay? So basically, this is like building a bridge between our script here and the developer console on the other side that lives in the browser. And now to finish this lecture, let's actually take this JavaScript code out of the HTML file and put it into its own separate JavaScript file. So what we have right now, this script here, is called an inline script. And the only advantage of an inline script is that we don't have to load another file. But on the other hand, it's pretty bad for separating the website content from the JavaScript logic. And so usually we use external JavaScript files, as I just mentioned. Okay, so let's come back to the sidebar here and create a new file, which I'm going to call script.js. And that's a pretty standard name for a JavaScript script. Okay, so let's take that back, come here, copy this code, and paste it here. And then once more, VS Code actually formatted the code here nicely. If it didn't on your computer, then just do that manually, and I will show you later how to set that up. Okay, and now we can get rid of this script here. Great, now we have a better separation of concerns between presentation and logic, and this also makes it easier to maintain code in the long run. All there is to do now is to link this JavaScript file to the HTML file, because right now our HTML has no way of knowing where the code is actually located. So if we execute this code by reloading the browser, now nothing will happen. Again, because this HTML file right now does not know where to find the JavaScript code. So let's do that connection, and we usually do that at the end of the body tag, okay? And actually we will use script again. Alright, but now this time we're not going to put any code inside this script element, but instead we are going to specify the source attribute. So here all we need to do is to then specify the name of the script and the location. Now in this case, this script, so this script.js file is in the same folder as index.html. So all we have to do here is to just write the file name like this. We don't have to specify the entire path to the file. Okay, so if we save this now and reload, then you see that it's back to working. So we have this pop-up here again, and then our result of this computation. Now, if you didn't get the alert window or this output here, then that means that your script file is probably not correctly linked to the HTML file. So in that case, please make 100% sure that the script file is in the exact same folder as the HTML file. Also, make sure that you correctly spelled script src, just as I have it here in my HTML. And finally, also make sure that you have no errors in your JavaScript code. So these are some common mistakes that I see people make, which then leads to their script not being correctly linked. Okay, but anyway, at this point, we no longer need index.html open here. And here we have only our code logic. The rest of the presentation is gone. And so this is much cleaner and much easier to work with. Great, so now you know how to link a JavaScript file to an HTML file, and then how to run it all in the browser. And that means that you're now finally able to really start learning the JavaScript language. So see you in the next lecture, where we're going to start doing just that. Welcome back. Let's now start to really learn the JavaScript language, starting with values and variables. And let's start by getting rid of some of the code that we have here. So this one here isn't doing anything, and let's also delete this one so that we don't get that annoying pop-up all the time. So in this section, I will be using persons as examples. For example, a person's name, a person's age, or a job. Alright? But anyway, let's talk about values now. So a value is basically a piece of data. So it's the most fundamental unit of information that we have in programming. For example, this text, Jonas, is a value. Alright, so this here is a value. And again, if we want to actually see this in the console, let's say console.log, and then open up the parentheses, and then close them here, and then the semicolons. So if I save and reload, then of course we get Jonas. Okay, and so Jonas here is the value. Or we can of course have different values. For example here, 23 is a value. Right? And so now we see 23 in the console. And the same is true up here. So in this line of code, where the values are actually 40, and 8, and 23, and 10. So all these four are different values. And then these mathematical operators here join them together to form just one value. And that value is then 61. Okay? And so a value is basically the smallest unit of information that we have in JavaScript. Now, one extremely useful thing that we can do with values is to store them into variables. And so this way, we can reuse them over and over again. For example, we can say let, and then the name of the variable, and then assign a value like Jonas to this variable. Okay? And so what we did here is called declaring a variable. Okay? And so this will actually create a real variable in your computer's memory, and will store this value inside of that variable. And actually, that is exactly what we did up here right in the beginning. So here we declared a variable called JS and assigned the value of amazing to that variable, right? And so now it hopefully makes sense to you what we did back then. So I like to imagine a variable like being a box. So in the real world, a box can hold some object, for example, a book, and we can then write a label on the box to describe what's in it. And then we can find the object later when we need it by using that label. And variables actually work in the exact same way. So here, basically, we have a box called first name. And into that box, we put the value of Jonas. And now if we want to use this value, all we have to do is to basically use this label. Or in other words, this variable name. So first name in this case. And so let's use it actually. And for that, once again, I will use console.log. And you will see me using console.log throughout this entire course, actually. So whenever we need to output something from our code to the browser, we always use console.log like this. And so here, now, instead of passing a literal value, like we did here, and here, and here, now we can pass in, so we can write here the variable name. So, first name. Okay? And if I save it and reload it, let's see what happens. Indeed, we get Jonas. So from line number 8, and so that's right here. And that means that indeed our variable declaration up here worked. And if we now change this to Bob, let's say, then here we should get Bob, right? And indeed, now it's Bob. Let's put it back. And of course, we can now use this variable name many times. So let's just copy and paste this here a couple of times and give it a save. And so now we have it 3 times. And that means that whenever JavaScript sees this variable name here, it will basically replace it with the original value that we assigned to the variable. So again, that's Jonas. And this is extremely useful, because now if I want to change the first name to something else, I only have to do it in one place. So just here. So let's change it here to Matilda. And if I save it now and reload, of course, it will change in all the 3 places. So this is one of the big advantages of variables. Without variables, I would now have to manually change the value everywhere to Matilda. But like this, everywhere where I reference this variable, it will automatically get changed to Matilda. So that's one of the most important things to keep in mind about variables. Great. And now that we know what a variable is, let's just very quickly talk about conventions and rules for naming variables, because we shouldn't just give random names to variables. So first, the way that I named this variable here is called camel case. Camel case means that whenever I have multiple words in a variable name, I write the first word with a lowercase and then all the next words with uppercase, like this. So if it was just first, we would write it like this. But if we had more than one word, like first name, person, then you see that all the subsequent words are written with this uppercase letter. And this is kind of a standard in the JavaScript world. But of course, there are other ways of naming variables. For example, we could write first name with an underscore like this. And this is very popular in other languages like Ruby. Or like this, okay? And you can use whatever you like most. Just keep in mind that it's kind of a standard in JavaScript to write variable names like this. So usually, whenever you see other people's code, the variables will usually be written using the camel case notation. So that's kind of a convention of how to name variables in JavaScript, but there are also some actual hard rules in JavaScript about how we can name variables. For example, we cannot write something like this, like 3 years, and set it to the value of 3. So this is an illegal variable name, and VS Code actually warns us right away here. And again, that's because this variable name starts with a number. And if we tried to load this in JavaScript, we would get this error. So that's an invalid or unexpected token here. And it's important to actually start reading these error messages right from the beginning of the course. So we see that this is a so-called syntax error, which means that we did a mistake in writing our code. So that's a mistake in the code's syntax. And we can also see the line where the error occurred, so line 13, so that we can then go ahead and fix it. And notice how this error was shown in the console, even though we didn't use console.log in this case. Okay, so we don't need to use console.log for the console to show errors. All the errors that we make will always end up in the console, and also here with this, error icon. Now anyway, back to our naming conventions here. So we already learned that variable names cannot start with a number. And in fact, variable names can only contain numbers, letters, underscores, or the $sign. So for example, if we try to write Jonas and Matilda equals JM, we would once again get a syntax error, right? And this time it's telling us unexpected token end. And again, that's because this symbol here is illegal in variable names. They can only contain numbers, letters, underscores, or the $sign. So this here, for example, would be allowed. So if we reload now, we get no more errors here. Another error might occur when we try to name a variable using a reserved JavaScript keyword. For example, if we did this, so new, for example, set it to 27, then this would also not be allowed. So you see unexpected token new. And that's because new is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, as we will see a little bit later. And the same goes for something like function. So again, unexpected token here. If we wanted to fix that, we could, for example, start this variable name with an underscore or with the $sign. So that's the only two symbols that are allowed besides letters and numbers. Another variable name that's kind of reserved but still actually allowed to use is the word name. So we could do this, and it would actually work, but in some cases, this creates some problems. Because again, this is kind of a reserved keyword, but it's still legal to use. But since it is a keyword, never call your variables just name. Okay? That's why I always call them first name like this. Let's actually get rid of this one because we already have first name up there. Now another convention is that we should not start a variable name with an uppercase letter. So we should not do this. So let person Jonas. Now again, it's a convention, so that's not illegal. It's just that we use this kind of variable names with an uppercase letter for a specific use case in JavaScript, which is object-oriented programming, as we will see later in the course. So for now, never do this, but instead, you should write it like this, with a lowercase letter starting. On the same note, variables that are all in uppercase are reserved for constants that we know will never change. For example, the number pi, which is like 3.1415, and so on and so forth. So we know that this number is never going to change, and so that's a constant, and for that we have a convention of writing it in all uppercase. And VS Code actually marks this variable name with a different color, because it knows about this convention that we use. Of course, you could also write it like this, but then this would be kind of weird, actually. So if it's a real constant, write it in uppercase like this. So that's a pretty normal convention there in programming as a whole. Finally, to finish this lecture, let's talk about one final convention, which is to make sure that our variable names are descriptive. And that's very important to write cleaner code. So when you name your variables, it should be really easy to understand exactly what value the variable is holding, just by reading the name of the variable. And that's kind of what we did up here by calling this one first name. But let me show you another example. For example, let's say my first job, programmer, and then my current job, teacher. So this is much, much better than writing this. So job 1, programmer, and job 2, teacher. So which set of variables do you think is more descriptive? Is it these ones or these ones? And I hope that you agree with me that it's much easier to understand what programmer and teacher are in this case here by simply looking at the variable name. So we know that my first job was programmer and that my current job is teacher. While down here, well, we would simply know that these are two different jobs. We don't know anything about them. And so this approach up here is a lot better. So keep that in mind whenever you write your own variable names. And actually keep all of this in mind that we just talked about for naming your variables. Okay? So just to quickly recap what a variable actually is, it is basically a box into which we can store a value. So we give that box a name, which in this case here is first name, or in this case here, it's my first job, for example. And then into that box with that label, we can store a value, which in this case is this programmer string here. Then later in the code, we can reference that variable over and over again. For example, like this. My first job, and if I save this, then of course, here we see programmer. Once again, you probably saw my code changing here automatically from the single quotes to double quotes, but that is just my automatic formatting doing its work. And now if we wanted to change this here, let's say coder, then it would change across the entire program, and now we get coder here. And that's what variables are all about. They're one of the most important things of programming, and so make sure to really understand them before you move on. So in the last lecture, we talked about values and variables. Now, in every programming language, values can have different types, depending on the type of data that we want them to hold. And we already saw strings and numbers, but there are actually more data types. So let's now take a look at all the types that we have in JavaScript. And first of all, in JavaScript, every value is either an object, which looks something like this, or a primitive value. So a value is only a primitive when it's not an object. And we will learn all about objects later, but for now, let's really focus on primitive data types. So there are 7 primitive data types: number, string, boolean, undefined, null, symbol, and big int. So let's look at them one by one. First, we have the number data type. And numbers are always so-called floating point numbers, which means that they always have decimals, even if we don't see them or don't define them. For example, the 23 value that we have here is exactly like having 23.0, but they're both simply the number data type. In many other programming languages, you will find different data types for integers and for decimals, but not in JavaScript. All numbers are simply of the type number, okay? Next up, we have strings, which are simply a sequence of characters, and so they're just used for text, as we already learned. And always put them in quotes, no matter if double quotes or single quotes. Otherwise, JavaScript will actually confuse them with variable names. The Boolean data type is essentially a logical type that can only take one of the logical values true or false. In other words, a Boolean is always either true or false. Alright? We use Boolean values to take decisions with code, as we will see later. And these are the 3 most important data types that we will deal with the most. But there are still 4 more, which might be a bit more confusing. So, first, undefined is the value taken by a variable that is not yet defined. And a variable that's not yet defined is simply just a variable that we declared, but without assigning a value. For example, like this children variable here. So basically, we can say that undefined means empty value. Then there's also null, which is actually pretty similar because it also means empty value, but it's used in different circumstances. But for now, don't worry about the details. I just want you to know that null also exists for now, okay? Anyway, next we have symbol, which was introduced in ES 2015. And this data type is not really useful for us. It simply defines a value that is unique and cannot be changed. And we will talk about this briefly by the end of the course. Finally, starting in ES 2020, there is also big int, which is for integers that are too large to be represented by the number type. So basically, it's another type for numbers, and we will talk about this one in another section. So these are the 7 primitive data types in JavaScript. But there's another fundamental thing to know about types, which is the fact that JavaScript has a feature called dynamic typing. This means that when you create a new variable, you do not have to manually define the data type of the value that it contains. In many other programming languages, you actually have to do that, but not in JavaScript. Instead, JavaScript automatically determines the data type of a value when it's stored into a variable. And this distinction between value and variable is pretty important, because in JavaScript, it's the value that has a type, not the variable. So variables simply store values that have a type. Many people don't know about this detail or just don't care, but this is how it actually works. Now, another important application of dynamic typing is that later in our code, we can assign a new value with a different data type to the same variable without a problem. For example, variable x can initially be a number and then later a string. That's not a problem at all. And this can of course be very useful, but it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs, which means errors in our code. Alright, so let's now actually see these things in action. But before we talk about data types, let's quickly talk about code commenting. So in programming, we use comments to literally comment code, or to deactivate code without deleting it. For example, here, I could write a single line comment using // and then I can describe what this code is doing. For example, here I can say variable name conventions. And JavaScript will completely ignore anything that is a comment. So anything that comes after // like this. Okay? And this can be really useful to kind of divide our code into different sections and to explain what different pieces of code are actually doing in our code. So that's a very useful application of comments, but another one is to simply comment out code that we don't want to be executed for some reason. For example, let's say we don't want this code here to be executed, but we also don't want to delete it. So we can simply comment it out like this. And so if I save it, and then when I reload, this 61 should be gone. So, you see? That's because JavaScript is now ignoring this code. It's just a comment. But since we didn't delete it, we can of course bring it back. So we can just delete it, and then it's back to normal. Now in VS Code, we can also automatically create comments using the command / shortcut. So that's command or control / to turn on, and then again to turn off. So that's single line comments, but we can go even further and also create multi-line comments. And to do that, we do it like this. We start a multi-line comment using / and then asterisk, and then we end it with the asterisk or star and then the /. And whatever comes here is then normal code. Okay? And with this, I effectively got rid of this first code that we typed in the first lecture, but without deleting it. And so I can keep it here basically as a reference. Alright? And so that's what I'm going to do in every lecture now. I will always kind of get rid of the previous code by using a multi-line comment like this. But now let's get back to the topic of this lecture, which is data types. So in the previous lecture, we already saw numbers and strings, right? So here we have a value, which is a number, and here we have a value, which is a string. So nothing new, right? That's what we learned at the beginning of the video. But we also talked about booleans, right? And so a boolean is a value that can only be true or false. And so if I write true, that is then automatically a boolean value, which is in this case true. Okay? And actually I can also log that to the console and then here you get true. And you can see that it's not a string because strings are printed in white, and this value is printed in this pink. And so it's actually really a Boolean value. And of course, we can also store Booleans in variables. So let's say JavaScript is fun, using the camel case notation that we learned about before, and then set it to true. And now we can log JavaScript is fun instead. But of course, the variable declaration here needs to happen before the log. And that's because JavaScript programs are executed from top to bottom like this. And more about that a bit later. Okay? What matters is that this needs to be at the end. So let's cut it and put it here. And also get rid of this one, save it, and here we still get true. And so here we created a nice and descriptive variable name holding a Boolean value. And remember that it's actually the value that holds the data type and not the variable, because I could now actually go ahead and change this to a value with another type. And actually I will do that in a second, but for now let's take a look at a special operator called typeof. So typeof is an operator just like a plus or the minus operator that we can use to show the type of a value. So let me show you how. So again we use console.log because we actually want to see the result of this operator in the console. So typeof, and then let's say just true. Okay? And more about how operators actually work and what they are a bit later in this section. For now, let's just see what happens when we reload this, and we see that it's a Boolean. So just as I said, the result of using this operator here on a value will be a new value, which is a string with the type of this value here. Okay? So let's do that again here, and we'll copy it just a couple of times, just like this to make it a bit faster. And so here, let's use JavaScript is fun, and so this should also be a Boolean, but just to make sure. Here, let's now use a number, and finally, a string. So just to prove you that these are actually numbers and strings. All right? And indeed, we see that JavaScript is fun is a Boolean, 23 is a number, and Jonas is a string. And speaking about strings, I just want to quickly emphasize that we really always need to use quotes in order to create a string. Okay? Let's actually show that here in the console. So we can use double quotes or single quotes, but we really do need quotes in order to create a string. So Jonas, for example, is a string. Okay? And so is Jonas with single quotes. But if we do it like this, then it's not going to work. So it needs to be the same at the beginning and the end. But without any quotes at all, JavaScript will see this as a variable. And so then we get this reference error, which is saying that Jonas is not defined. And that's because it's looking for a variable that does not exist. We never declared a variable called Jonas, right? And so that's why we get this error here. So when you need a string, don't forget the quotes. This is a mistake that I see beginners make all the time, and so really be careful about that. Now, moving on, let's actually see dynamic typing in action. And remember that dynamic typing simply means that we can easily change the type of a value that is held by a variable. So that sounds a bit fancy, but it's really as simple as this. So we already have a variable called JavaScript is fun, and so let's now reassign that variable. So we do that like this. So we write the name of the variable, then equal, and then a new value. And what matters is that we do not write the let here again. So this let keyword. So the first time that we declare a new variable, we need to do it using let. But then when we want to change the value of the variable, we simply write it again like this, but without the let. So we simply assign a new value here to this already existing variable. And this is actually the first time that we did that, and so it's important to understand what happened here, okay? So again, we first declared a new variable with this name and assigned it this true value, and then down here, we changed the value that is in the variable. So using the box analogy from before, it's like initially putting a book in a box, and then later taking the book out of the box and instead putting a phone in the box. And so, just like here, we changed the content of the box. In our example here, we changed from true to the string of yes. Okay? And now, let's just grab this piece of code here, so that we can see that dynamic typing actually works. So if I reload now, then let's see, well we get here from line 34, let's actually simplify this here a little bit. So commenting out this code, and I'm using command or control /. Let's reload again. And so you see that initially the type of JavaScript is fun is a Boolean, right? But then we change it to a string down here. And so indeed, when we then test the type of the variable again in line 39, then we get the result of a string, all right? And that basically is dynamic typing. Great. And now let's see an example of undefined. So remember that number, string, and Boolean are the most used data types. But there are more, like undefined and null, and also symbol and big int. But in this lecture, I'm only going to talk about the three most important ones, and then also undefined and null. So remember that undefined is the value taken by a variable that is not yet defined. So basically undefined means an empty value. So it's perfectly legal in JavaScript to do this. So to define a variable without a value. And if we now take a look at this variable, then we should see undefined. And actually, let's also check the type, so that I can show you something. Here. Okay, and so you get both undefined. What this means is that whenever we declare an empty variable, the value of the variable will be undefined, and the type of the variable is also undefined. Now that maybe sounds a bit confusing, but it's really not. So simply put, undefined is both the value and the type of the value. And undefined is different than other types in this way. But this detail is not really important. What matters is that when you declare an empty variable like this, it will automatically hold the value of undefined. And that's why we got undefined here. Then, just like before, we can also reassign this variable basically. So we can now go ahead and say year 1991. And once more, without the let, because we are not creating a new variable. We are simply assigning a new value to year. So it used to be undefined, right, as we just discussed, and now I'm changing it to 1991. And so, if I test for the type now again, it should now be a number, right? So let's check that, and indeed, we can again see the effect of dynamic typing. Great, and now finally, just to quickly finish, I want to show you an error that exists in the type of operator. So all I'm going to do here is to quickly say console.log type of null. So remember that null is just another data type, and it's similar to undefined. And it's also similar in the fact that both the value and the type of the value are null. Okay? Now about this bug, JavaScript says that the type of null is an object. And this doesn't make any sense at all. And so this is regarded as a bug or an error in JavaScript. However, this bug is never corrected for legacy reasons. But null is of course not an object. This should return null just as type of undefined returns undefined. So just keep that in mind when working with type of. But we will also come back to this later in the course to make sure that you don't create any accidental bugs because of this weird behavior. Okay, and that's all I had to tell you about data types in JavaScript. Let's now take a look at the 3 different ways of declaring variables in JavaScript. So up until this point, we have always used the let keyword to declare variables. However, there are also const and var. Now, let and const were introduced in ES6, and so they are modern JavaScript, while the var keyword is the old way of declaring variables. So let's learn how they are different and which one to use in which situations. And let's again start by getting rid of this code. Actually, all I will do is move this to the end, and in the future I will just do this before recording the next video. So anyway, we use the let keyword to declare variables that can change later, so basically during the execution of our program. And that's exactly what we did here. So we used let to declare JavaScript is fun, and then we changed that later from true to yes. Right? For example, or another example I would say is, let's set the age to 30 at one point of the program, and then in another point of the program, we can change it to something else. For example, when the person turns 31. And then the age, of course, changes from 30 to 31. And so it's perfectly okay to declare a variable with let at one point in the program, and then later assign a new value to it. In technical terms, we call this reassigning a value to a variable, or also we say that we mutate the age variable in this case. So it was 30, and now it's 31. And so we mutated the variable. Okay, so that's a term that you will hear all the time in the JavaScript world. So when we need to mutate a variable, that's the perfect use case for using let. And that also counts for the case that we want to declare empty variables. So for example, as we did here, where we declared an empty year, and then later reassigned that variable to 1991. And sometimes we actually do this in practice. For example, when we want to declare all the variables at the top of a file, but only assign actual values to them later in the program, for example, based on some condition. Now, on the other hand, we use the const keyword to declare variables that are not supposed to change at any point in the future. So the value in a const variable cannot be changed. For example, let's say the birth year. 1991, for example. If we then tried to reassign that, let's say to 1990, it should not work. So let's test that, and indeed we get a type error. So assignment to constant variable. And so that's exactly what the const keyword does. It creates a variable that we cannot reassign, or in technical terms, an immutable variable. So a variable that cannot be mutated. Okay? And the birth year is a perfect example for that, because in fact, the birth year of a person can never change, while the age, of course, can change. And so that's why we used let for the age and const for the birth year. Okay? That makes sense? Now, the fact that variables created with const are immutable also means that we cannot declare empty const variables. For example, this is not legal. So let's comment out this one here, again, with command or control slash, so that it doesn't get in our way here. And then reload, and then we get an error, missing initializer in const declaration. And so this error message means that when using const, we need basically an initial value. Alright, so just like here. Now, with these 2 different ways of declaring variables, you will probably ask, should I use let or should I use const to declare a new variable? Well, as a best practice for writing clean code, I always recommend to use const by default, and let only when you are really sure that the variable needs to change at some point in the future. For example, when you have a variable that's really never supposed to change, like this birth year, you should always use const. Also, if you are sure that the age variable is never changing inside your program, you should declare it using const as well. The reason for this is that it's a good practice to have as little variable mutations or variable changes as possible, because changing variables introduces a potential to create bugs, so basically errors in your code. So again, by default, always just use const, and let when you're sure that the value of the variable needs to change at some point in your code. And so from now on, I will probably use the const way of declaring variables as much as possible. Now, there's also a third way in JavaScript of declaring variables, which is the var keyword. But this one should actually be completely avoided, okay? However, we should still know how it works for legacy reasons, because you will see this maybe in older code bases or some older tutorials that you find online. So let's take a look at how it works. So var is basically the old way of defining variables, prior to ES6. And at first sight, it works actually pretty much the same as let. So we can write var job equals programmer, and then just like with let, we can change the value of the variable later. Just like this. Let's take this one out, and let's just reload. And we didn't get any errors, which means that it's basically allowed to mutate this job variable when we use var, right? Now, although it looks like var and let are very similar, below the surface they're actually pretty different. And actually there are also many differences between let, const, and var, so between all three of them. And you will learn all about these differences later in section 7, because this is actually really important stuff. And I know that I keep saying that you will learn some topics later in the course, but the truth is that learning is really not linear. It cannot happen in a linear way. So you sometimes need more advanced things right now, even without understanding them. But that's no problem, because you will understand them eventually. So right now, it would really not be useful for you to know that let is block scoped and that var is function scoped, right? Because you don't even know what a block or what a function really is. And so we will learn about these differences in section 7. For now, what matters is that you should basically never use var, okay? Now, just to finish, some people will probably point out that we actually don't even have to declare variables at all, because it's actually not mandatory. We can just write something like this. Last name equals Schmetman, in my case. And then we can just use this variable name, in this case by logging it to the console, and JavaScript will happily execute this script even without us declaring the variable, right? We didn't use let, nor const, nor var in this case, but it still worked. However, this is actually a pretty terrible idea, because this doesn't create the variable in the current so-called scope. Instead, JavaScript will create a property on the global object. And once again, you'll understand a little bit later what all of this means. But what matters is that you should always properly declare variables. Okay? Never just write a variable like this without really declaring it. Great. You're doing great progress here, even though our code doesn't really do anything yet, and we're not really writing any real applications yet, right? But we still need to get some fundamentals down before we can do that. And so that's really important, and that's why I'm stressing all the little details about everything here. And I hope you see how important that is for your progress, okay? And don't worry, we will get to the cool stuff even a bit later in this first section, okay? But for now, in the next video, let's talk about operators in JavaScript.